Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's class on measuring for lean. I hope you are doing well. So, the first question that I would like to address regarding measuring performance is why is it important for any organization to measure performance? And so there are many reasons, and I'm going to start the lecture off with discussing a couple of key reasons why it's important to measure performance for an organization. The first one is it's through measuring performance that a company can understand the areas that are most in need of improvement. Secondly, when you measure performance, you can get a picture of performance over time. And not only that, you can also get a good indication of what direction the organization and various departments are going in. Furthermore, another big reason that it's very beneficial to measure performance is that once you have these measurements and metrics in place, managers can base their decisions on objective rather than subjective analysis. So they can back their decisions with numbers, with figures, with metrics. Yet another reason is that measuring performance drives continuous improvement. If there is a department that has been doing well, they will be more inclined, they will be, once their performance is measured, they will get good feedback, they will get remuneration according to their performance, and they will be more motivated or further motivated to improve their performance. There is definitely a relationship between measurement, motivation of people in a company, the effort that they put in their work, and performance. And so measurement done in the right way can really catapult and help an organization improve its performance. Therefore, keeping all of these reasons in mind, it's extremely important to measure performance in any organization. Now, the question is, how is measurement of performance usually done in organizations? It's done in a variety of ways. Generally speaking, every year, an annual report is made for public organizations. And for those that are private organizations, they also make internal books of account, and in which they basically do calculate their balance sheet, their income statement, their cash flow. And in both cases, certain ratios are also calculated, and these are some metrics. Also, year-to-year performance is checked. So, for example, if you look in an annual report, you will see a comparison between 2 years, and so that is it's very easy to get some sort of an indication at the rate of performance change. Obviously, if the rate of performance has been improving, that's really good news. And so it's very positive, and many times this helps increase the share value of the company. If for some reason it's been going down, there may be some external factors. You can definitely go into the notes of the annual report, and usually it's explained as to what the reasons were for the decrease. And so regardless, measuring performance and the rate of change is something that is done regularly. One other thing that is done, internally, usually within companies, is performance benchmarking. And so this is very beneficial. So a company's performance is never looked at in isolation. In fact, benchmarking basically means you compare yourself against competitors. So for example, if your company has had a 10% increase in net income, that may be something that you're celebrating and you're really happy about. But if you look and compare against your competitors, maybe on average, all your competitors got a 30% increase in net income during the year. So in that case, then you may say, you know what, okay, we did well, but there's room for improvement. And so, it puts performance in perspective. So again, benchmarking is another something that's done to measure performance by the organizations. This can also be done on an organizational level, on a high level, but sometimes various departments are also benchmarked um, against each other, and so again that gives an indication of how which departments within organizations need improvement versus others. Now, measurement is very good, but there is a dark side of measurement as well. And the truth is that if you don't measure in the right way, you have a poor measurement system in place, there can be many repercussions. You may be perhaps having too many performance indicators. So if you are measuring too many things in an organization, you kind of lose focus, and that's not a good situation to be in, because then you really don't have no idea what areas need improvement. You're just kind of just overwhelmed with a ton of information. Secondly, you may be measuring the wrong things, and we'll be discussing a little bit more about what are the right ways to measure different types of companies later on in this lecture. But you need to make sure that you're measuring the right things in an organization. And encouraging behavior that is not at all what management expected. So sometimes measurement creates the wrong kind of messages in the organization. So it sends the wrong messages in the organization, especially if you're measuring the wrong things. People will lose focus. Maybe they'll start paying attention to things that really that are not beneficial for the organization. So there's definitely a dark side of measurement. You have to be mindful that you're measuring the right metrics, the right things. All right. Now, moving forward, I want to talk a little bit about the process view of supply chains. And so in supply chains, generally speaking, there are, four primary cycles. So if you look at this slide, for example, you'll see that a customer basically will go to a retailer and they'll buy some things from a retailer. So this is the customer order cycle, right? And the retailer will get in touch with a distributor and make sure that they have enough goods in their store. And so that's a replenishment cycle. And then the distributor actually gets in touch with the manufacturer and makes sure that the manufacturer makes enough goods so that they can then sell it to the retailer, who can then sell it to the customer. So this is between the distributor and the manufacturer, there is a manufacturing cycle. And finally, the manufacturer needs some supplies to make the goods. So they get in touch with the supplier, and they're in a procurement cycle. So if you really look at supply chain, there are these four kinds of cycles that are, really moving within a supply chain. Within each one of these cycles, there's a lot of activities that happen. Let me give you an example. A supplier will market their products. So this, we're basically, kind of looking at the procurement cycle in this situation. And so supplier will market their products, and then, maybe a manufacturer will place an order. Say, okay, we would like X amount of goods, and the supplier will, sorry about that. And then the supplier will receive the order, and then the supplier will fill the order, as in they will, make sure that the order is complete and send it over to the buyer. And then the buyer will receive the order, and then they will pay for the order. So as you can see, there's a lot of activities happening within each one of these cycles. So it's a quite a complex set of activities that happen within a supply chain. Generally, in supply chain management, there are a lot of processes. And what processes basically means is anything that takes inputs and transforms them or changes them and makes outputs. So if you look at, for example, an order fulfillment, this is a process. And this is a process for orders. And it starts off with an input of a receipt of an order. So receive, that's the input. And then the order is, fulfilled. That's the process. And the output is the delivery of the product. Okay. And then if we look at production, here the input is receipt of materials. And then those materials are, go through the production process. And then by the end, the output is a completion of the product. Similarly, outbound logistics starts off with an input of end of manufacturing. And, again, the output is delivery to customer. In procurement, it starts off, the input is issuing a purchasing order, and the output is actually receipt of the supplies. Customer service, the input is arrival of the customer, and the output is departure of the customer. New product development starts off with product development start and ends with an actual launch of a product. And in the cash cycle, it starts off with expenditure of funds and ends up with collection of revenue. So as you can see, for any process in any organization, there are inputs, and then, there's a final output. And so there's a certain amount, the processes where, the work is done that transforms the inputs into the outputs. Now, one thing, and so before I go on, generally speaking, and I'll be discussing this a little bit later on in a couple slides down, but you want to, each one of these needs to be measured, right? How you're managing your inputs, how your process is working, and, the output. So each one of these three steps needs to be measured in a supply chain. And and for all of these, it depends on the business you're in, and we'll be discussing about that in a little bit. But for every process, for every key process, these need to be measured. Now, there's a little bit of an important thing that needs to be mentioned, that the metric that you use, or let's say the ratio or the key measurements that you decide to keep as the key measurement criteria, they should be four things. They should be robust, meaning that the metric that you use should be interpreted similarly by all users. And so, for example, if you want to look at net income, okay, just giving a very wild kind of an example over here. Net income is a term that is interpreted similarly across all organizations. You want to check the return on equity, right? Return on equity is something that's a metric, and that's interpreted similarly across all organizations. Everybody has the same idea of what return on equity, how it's calculated. So that's an example of a robust measure. Now, if all of a sudden you're kind of coming up with some unique kind of a metric that only you've come up with in your organization, that's not going to be able to be interpreted similarly, so it's not going to be robust. The second thing that a metric should be is valid. And so what this means is it should accurately capture events and activities measured and controls for exogenous factors. So what this means is that your measurement should be covering all the various activities that are happening in an organization to the best of its ability. So it should be very valid. So it should really be capturing a lot of the activity that's happening, a lot of the events and activities. And it should capture those events and activities very accurately. It should also somehow be able to reflect controls in place for external factors that are beyond the control of an organization. But the key again is that your measurements should be, accurately capturing what's going on in the organization. The next thing is that key metrics should be integrative. And what this means is that the metric should include all relevant aspects of the process and promote coordination amongst functions and divisions. So integrative basically means that it should be covering like a lot, what's going on in the whole organization. So across different departments. So it should be a very, across the board kind of measurements, not just very small, just for one department, but very integrative. Finally, the metrics should be very useful. And this basically means that metrics that are readily understandable by decision makers and provide a guide to action. So if there's a metrics that extremely complicated and nobody even understands what it means, that's not a useful metrics. Your metrics should be easy to be understood, and they should basically be, easy. Once you look at them and key decision makers understand them, they can use those metrics to make decisions for the organization. So the interesting thing, however, is that there's usually a little bit of a trade-off. So if, for example, you want something that a metrics that's very integrative, and so it's covering pretty much, across the board, everything that's happening in an organization. Well, and it can be integrative, so basically covering, a big array of activities, but then it's very difficult. It's going to be valid, meaning it's very difficult. It's going to take into account every single small little event and activity that happens. If it's integrative, it's going to be perhaps a little more broad than, but if it's going to be valid, it's going to be very specific and covering everything in detail. So there is a trade-off between these two. Again, useful and robust. If it's, for example, very robust and everybody knows that these metrics are, common across the board, great. But the metrics that are robust may not necessarily be completely useful for an organization. They may be, but they may not be. Perhaps there are some specific ones that, metrics that are more useful to an organization. Even though they're not robust, they may be more useful to an organization. So again, you see a little bit of trade-off over here. And, again, there's, there is a trade-off between how robust, metrics are versus how valid they are. And so you see that generally speaking, there are some trade-offs. Keeping that in mind, companies still need to really build their, the design of metrics that they will be using in their organization. Okay, next I'm going to start talking a little bit about, various performance dimensions and what metrics, and the metric design that companies usually make for themselves. So as I mentioned earlier on, there are three basic steps that need to be measured for each one for any process. The first is the inputs, the second is the actual process, and the third is the output. And so the first set of metrics that usually companies, do try to focus on is called utilization. And in utilization, these are some metrics that basically measure the actual input divided by the capacity. And don't worry, I'm going to explain each one of these in more detail in the next few slides, but I just want to give you a high-level overview on this slide. Next, companies want to measure the actual process. And so here, there's, obviously input versus output when you're looking at process. And so here, in order to measure the process, they use a set of metrics that are known as productivity ratios, right? So here, to measure inputs, they use utilization ratios. To measure the process, they use productivity ratios. And then finally, to measure the output, they actually check the effectiveness. So for example, here they're going to look at the actual output versus some sort of a metrics. For example, number of orders that were received on time versus the total number of orders. So again, this is checking the effectiveness. How effective was your output? And effective basically means that the end objective was achieved. So I'm going to explain each one of these now to you a little bit more in detail. So one of the first metrics that is very commonly used in organizations are the utilization metrics. And we're talking about supply chain, okay? And so in supply chain, utilization metrics are used. They are a measure of input usage, usually represented as a ratio of the actual amount used to a norm value, and usually the norm value is the organization's capacity. So let's just look at some examples, and I think it will become a lot more clearer to you. So some examples of utilization metrics are labor hours used divided by total budgeted labor hours. So let's say a department had 100 budgeted hours. That was the amount of hours that they could use for labor, and how much of those budgeted did they actually use. So that's an example of utilization. Then another one is the area of a warehouse that's occupied divided by the total warehouse area. Again, these are all, input related ratios. And a third one of utilization is hours of machine used divided by the machine capacity. So these are some examples of utilization, again, more to do with the raw material usage or the input usage. Okay. Next up is productivity metrics. These are usually, productivity metrics are a measure of transformational efficiency, usually presented as a ratio of the actual output produced to actual input consumed. Again, I'm just going to give some examples of this, and I think it's going to get a lot more clearer for you. So, all right, so let's look at one of this. Orders processed divided by the total number of labor hours. So how much was actually produced? How many orders were processed and the input is, so that's the output, right? Orders that were processed, and the input is number of labor hours. So usually the result of productivity metrics is 5, I'm just giving an example, 5 5 orders per labor hour. So that's the kind of, it's usually given as the output is given according to the unit of input. Another example is the number of pallets unloaded divided by the hours of dock time. So again, this will give you an idea of how many pallets were unloaded per hour of dock time. So the third one is ton miles delivered divided by cost incurred. So again, these are all examples of, productivity, what's actually happened. So how much of output was generated per unit of input. The third type of metrics is the effectiveness metrics. These metrics are a measure of quality of the process output, usually presented as a ratio of the actual output to a norm output, competitive, standard, etc. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. One is number of items filled divided by the number of items requested. So here you're again checking, okay, there were so many number of items that were requested, but how many items were or orders were we actually able to fulfill? So there were so many orders, there were 100 orders that came in, but how many were we able to fulfill? And that could be like maybe 100 orders came, we were able to fulfill 50. So, we have in that case a 50% fill rate. So that's an example, right? Another one is number of shipments on time divided by number of shipments sent. So you're kind of seeing, what you're doing actually right versus the overall. So again, here, number of shipments on time divided by the number of shipments sent. So let's say there were, 150 shipments that went, but let's say, just 10 actually reached on time. So you would say 1 over, the total, 175. Another example of effectiveness ratio is number of transactions without error divided by number of transactions. So here you're seeing, how effective, how many things were done correctly. And so these are, when in supply chain management, these are some commonly used metrics to understand how well the supply chain is functioning. And again, you want to be looking at, in order to judge the performance of a supply chain, you want to be looking across the process, and you want to be looking at, how well your inputs are being utilized, how good is the productivity, and how effective is your output. So those are three things that generally companies look at. Now, in supply chain management, many companies go on to build a balanced metric system. And in this balanced metric system, they generally have, a triangular kind of a representation. They have three basic sets of metrics. One is asset utilization. And again, you see the word utilization and asset. So you can easily tell that this is what we discussed a little bit earlier. It's sort of this utilization metrics that they're looking at over here. Here, some examples that they've given over here is, so again, it's the same words, just being presented a little bit differently. And in the utilization metrics, they've included things such as facility utilization, inventory turns, cash to cash cycle, again, very similar to everything we discussed in utilization metrics. And next is the efficiency metrics. And again, this is sort of in line with the productivity metrics. And here they're looking at labor productivity, supply chain costs. And the third kind of metrics that they usually have are the effectiveness metrics. And here they're checking the customer response, the order cycle time, perfect order fulfillment, the quality, new product time to market. So again, it's basically this balanced metric system in supply chain management. This is just this gives you an idea, right? So the first couple of slides, I kind of discussed what each one of these are. And now you can see that, some additional information has just been added. So, but the idea is the same. You're measuring, the utilization, the productivity, and finally the effectiveness. Now, the question is, how much of each one of these metrics should you have in a balanced metric system? Should you be measuring more of the efficiency, more of the utilization, more of the, effectiveness? Which ones should a company be focused on? And it really depends. So if, it depends on the type of industry that a company is in. So let's start off with, goods or, an industry such as pharmaceutical, fashion, media, and entertainment. Now, in each one of these, pharmaceutical, fashion, apparel, media, and entertainment, these are all, in industries that have high margins, so high profits, and short life cycles. So, for example, pharmaceutical companies, in the industry, they need to sort of come up with new medicine, launch new medication every so often. Same with fashion apparel. You'll see designs go out of fashion, new fashions come in. There's fads, there's styles that come in and out of fashion. And then in media and entertainment, there are new movies that are released very often. So they all have a pretty short life cycle, and a high margin. For such industries, they usually emphasize more on the customer response or the effectiveness. So, meeting a customer, the quality requirements, perfect order fulfillment, making sure that things reach customers on time, they're the right quality, getting feedback from the customers is really, really key for them. So, when they're measuring companies in this industry, when they're measuring their supply chains, they're going to want to measure the customer response a lot more as compared to the other two metrics. Now, let's look at now, on the other hand, some capital intensive industries. And these are industries that, the raw material is very, very expensive. So for example, petrochemical, semiconductor fab, commodities, steel, paper. So if you're looking at a steel mill, for example, the inputs are really, really expensive. And so they're going to be looking in making sure that, how is their asset utilization? So they're really going to be looking at, facility utilization, inventory turns. They're going to want to maximize the output using as little of input as possibly can be used. So for these kind of industries, they're going to be focusing on the utilization, the asset utilization metrics. So if they're going to make a balanced scorecard, and I'll be discussing balanced scorecard just a couple slides later, but if they're going to be, designing metrics, then they're going to be having more of the asset utilization metrics. And then finally, there are going to be some other industries such as food and beverage, basic goods, retail, and industrial supplies. These are goods, these are all industries that have low margin and they have mature products. So for example, milk or eggs or toothpaste or soap. I mean, these are all goods that they don't have a very low, they have a pretty low margin. They don't make a lot of profit per soap, per toothpaste, but they sell in big quantities and they're generally mature products. They've all been in the market for years and years. And so for them, they're really looking at the efficiency metrics, right? So they're looking at labor productivity, the overall supply chain costs, and just kind of making sure that things are being done as efficiently, things are moving across the supply chain as efficiently as possible. So they're going to be looking at, less time being used and things moving along as quickly as possible. So again, if you look at it, it's the metrics are different according to various industries. Some overall measures of financial performance that are across the board used by a lot of people include ROE and ROA. So your net income compared to equity is return on equity, and your return on assets is net income over your total assets. So again, here you're looking at, okay, you have an investment of assets, how much income are you generating as compared to the assets? And again, here an ROE, you're seeing, okay, you know what, this is, so much of equity or so much money has been injected in a organization, perhaps by shareholders or various other means. And so how much of income is being generated as compared to the money or that has gone into the company. So these are two metrics that are used pretty much across the board in many companies. So this is just an example of a balanced scorecard, and a scorecard, which basically you can see over here, it's kind of like a summary situation where you have all your performance metrics that you are going to be measuring for in a company and a description of what they are. And as I mentioned, in this lecture, it really varies company to company. The scorecards vary according to which industry a company is in and which, internally what metrics they think would be the most useful and integrative and robust and valid, right? And so it varies company to company. So in a supply chain or a balanced scorecard, another term introducing right now is a balanced scorecard. And generally speaking, in a balanced scorecard, you are trying to give an overall balanced view of an organization. So, you can have some, more supply chain oriented scorecards. But if companies generally make, balanced scorecards, here I've said supply chain because maybe, there's this balanced scorecard emphasizes, more, you can have more emphasis on a certain area. But the whole idea of a balanced scorecard is that you're covering, you're giving an overall, like a report card of the overall, how the company is doing. So generally you want to have some financial metrics, you want to check how the customers are doing, the customer related, like the fill rate and all of these back order levels, on time delivery. You're also going to be checking so the internal business processes, how well they're doing, and also a little bit of HR, how what type of HR practices there are. So this is just a basic example of a balanced scorecard and what a balanced scorecard looks for. um just to give you an idea, we've discussed this before also in this lecture, but there are many moving parts in a supply chain. And this slide gives you an overview of all the various activities happening in an supply chain. Now, it's not possible to measure every single small minutia detail, because as mentioned earlier, if you have way too many measurements, then it gets it's useless, because people get lost in all the details. So but it's very important to have metrics in place that you can get an overview or understanding of how the supply chain overall is operating, right? So you don't want that there are huge gaps in the measurement of of the supply chain. So generally speaking, the measurements that a company is using, um, they should be they should have certain characteristics. And so first of all, it should be crystal clear what every metrics is measuring. So for example, just to give you an idea, in this metric scorecard there is a description. So you have the metric and it describes exactly what it is measuring. So this should be very clear, right? For any metrics across the board in the organization. Secondly, there should be certain performance targets that are made. And ideally these, should be based on not just some random figure. So a company shouldn't just, a CEO shouldn't just come and say, okay, well, I want you to increase the net income by 100% next year. That's not going to work, because you have to have realistic performance targets. So you have to check what's going on. You have to benchmark. You have to look what's happening in the industry, what's happening amongst your competitors. If there are any external factors that may be affecting the performance of the organization. So keeping all of those things in mind, usually performance targets are given based on metrics. And then the actual performance needs to be measured. And finally, an action plan needs to be made. So for example, if there's a gap between what the target was and the actual performance, then action plans are made to make sure that that doesn't happen next time around. So a couple of things about how do we know if the metrics we're using are good or not. Let me just mention a couple of things. The metrics should be linked and supporting corporate strategy and objectives. So there has to be some sort of a link between what the organization's goals are and what the metrics that are being measured are. So that's very important. Secondly, it should be presented in a way that managers appreciate. So metrics should be easy for managers to understand and to use in their day-to-day work. It should not result in unintended consequences or behavior. The metrics should be useful. They should not be causing problems to an organization. The use of data so that is used to calculate the metrics should be easily visible throughout the organization. There should be transparency. Cost of obtaining measurement data should not outweigh the value of the data. Quite simple. I mean, it shouldn't be rocket science to calculate these metrics. Performance targets should be reviewed and adjusted regularly. Again, if the targets are unrealistic, it leads to a lot of demotivation across the organization, and negative kind of behavior sets in. There should be a promotion of teamwork and cross-functional cooperation across the supply chain. There should be more stress of accomplishment rather than activities, and they should relate to what a customer really wants rather than what the manager thinks a customer wants. So again, the goals should be highly realistic. The metrics should be Overall, they should just make a lot of sense pretty much across the board. There should be transparency, they should be realistic, and they should really help motivate the organization to achieve its goals and objectives. All right, so is it just enough to measure a company's performance, or should a company actually be looking and measuring the supplier's performance, the suppliers that it works with? Should they be measuring the supplier's performance as well? So this is an interesting question, and the answer to this question is that you must measure your supplier's performance as well. Nowadays, suppliers are considered to be partners. They are not considered an anti-party who you're trying to squeeze as much as possible and just make a lot of money and give them very little money. You should actually be working in liaison with them, working towards a common objective of fulfilling customers' needs. And generally speaking, it's very important to have good relationships with your customers and know that they're going to be able to be there for you when you need them. Because if the supplier is not able to give you what you need, then you won't be able to do your job in the company. So that's why nowadays a lot of companies, they basically have key performance indicators of of companies, and so of the suppliers. So key performance indicators are measurements of a supplier or supplier's provider's performance in key activities. So they kind of create KPIs for all suppliers to check how the performance of their suppliers. Now, obviously, if for some reason, they aren't able to, all of a sudden they increase their prices, or they aren't able to deliver on time, or their quality goes down, which are some of the key performance indicators, then you as a company will know that there's something wrong, and you can dig deeper and try and resolve the issue, right? So again, some key performance indicators for suppliers and do include price, the total product cost, delivery, performance to schedule, and quality, product reliability, and consistency. So again, the kinds of metrics that you make to measure your supplier's performance, they vary. It's not like there's a set that has to be followed. And basically, for a company, they need to figure out, who they want to work with, and develop these kind of report cards and constantly, regularly check the performance of their suppliers. And if for some reason the supplier's performance is dipping in any one area, they should immediately, talk to the suppliers, figure out what's going on. And, if for some reason the problems seem really, small, maybe they can chip in, work out the issues together. If for some reason the supplier is facing some really, really big problems, then perhaps, the company can consider moving to other suppliers. This is an example of a supplier's excellence scorecard. I just wanted to give you a visual example. And again, high level, the performance is being checked, a percentage is being given for the supplier, their name and information is given over here, and they're getting an overall A. So when somebody looks at the scorecard, okay, you say, okay, big check mark, let's continue to work with the supplier. They are not facing any problems. Some things that definitely do want to check in terms of suppliers is the storage space utilization, order fill rate. Are they being able to fulfill the orders that you've given them? Are they able to fulfill your orders on time? The warranty costs, overall scrap, rework, are they making a lot of mistakes? So these are kind of some of the things that to keep in mind in terms of checking of supplier metrics. All right, finally, at the end of this lecture, I want to just mention a couple of key supply chain terms. I've mentioned this already many times in the lectures and during our case studies, but I still want to talk about this just a little bit more on these slides. So there is a difference between cycle time and lead time in supply chain management. Lead time is basically the point from when an order is received from a customer all the way until the order is delivered to the customer. So the entire time, and I many times give an example of ordering, let's say, food on Food Panda. The minute that you place the order on the website, till you actually get the order in your hand, your food delivery in your hand, that whole time is the lead time. The cycle time has a lot to do with production, and here it's basically when an order is taken for production until the order is completed. So it's basically the production cycle time. So the production starts and the production is finished, and that whole time is known as the cycle time. Generally speaking, the cycle time is less than the lead time. Finally, this is something I also want to mention over here. I've discussed what dark time many times is, and the dark time should be should be aligned to the demand in the market. So basically, it's the time it takes for production, the rate of production. So this rate of production should be the same rate at which demand is coming in. So just to give you a quick understanding, the formula for talk time is the working time available divided by customer demand. The work time available is basically the full shift minus breaks and meetings, etc. And in the denominator is the demand for that production period. So within that period of time, what is the demand? And this will then give you the talk time. With that, I come to an end to this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a little bit about various metrics, supply chain metrics that companies use to measure performance. I hope you understood a little bit about what scorecards are, what a balanced scorecard is, also how companies keep an eye on their suppliers' performance as well. And I look forward to having a conversation about all of these concepts with you soon. Thank you.